Yes, please.
Well, friends, before I begin, I am Ashok Singhvi from India. I'm going to be hosting your event. And before I begin, I'd like to wish all those in America very, very good morning. Those in England, good afternoon. Those in India, good evening. And those east of India, a good supper. I cannot say good evening to you, but I'll say good supper to you, all of you. I hope and I'm happy that you are able to join us. Esteemed Professor Marcia McNutt, President of the National Academy of Sciences of USA, Professor Geoffrey Boulton, Order of British Empire, and Fellow of the Royal Societies of London and Edinburgh, and member of the International Council of Science governing body, Professor Naomi Oreskes, Professor of Earth Science and History of Science at the University of Harvard, and an author of many best-selling books, including Why Trust Science, Professor Holden Thorp, Editor-in-Chief of Science Journals, Professor Chandrima Shaha, President of the Indian National Science Academy, respected past presidents of the Academy, fellows of INSA, fellows of INIAS, the young scientists and the teacher awardees of INSA, faculty members, students from various universities, IITs and ISAs of India, all the distinguished colleagues, the members of the public and the media who have kindly joined us on this truly stellar event to celebrate Jawaharlal Nehru Birth Century Medal Award. This lecture will be followed by a panel discussion on the role of academies. Friends, it gives me an immense pleasure to welcome you all to this rare confluence of stellar personalities. And without much ado, it is my pleasure to invite the President of Indian National Science Academy, Professor Chandrima Shaha, to formally welcome the guest and tell you a bit about the Indian National Science Academy and about the Jawaharlal Nehru Award. Professor Shaha's address will be followed by a presentation of the citation of the award by Professor N.K. Mehra, Vice President, International Affairs, and then we'll have the award presentation followed by the lecture. Over to Professor Shaha.
Thank you, Professor Singhvi. Professor Marcia McNutt, President of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, Professor Geoffrey Boulton, member of the governing board of the International Science Council, Professor Naomi Oreskes of Earth Sciences, Harvard University, Professor Holden Thorp, Editor-in-Chief of Science Journals, Professor Ajay Sood, former President INSA, Professor Kishan Lal, former President INSA, and all other INSA former vice presidents, current vice presidents, and fellows, and the very distinguished audience. It is such a pleasure welcoming you all to this special occasion when we shall get to listen to Professor Marcia McNutt, who is being conferred with the 17th Jawaharlal Nehru Birth Centenary Medal for international cooperation in science and technology and for contributions to public understanding in science. As many of you know, Professor McNutt has many distinctions to her credit, including many firsts. We shall listen to that more in about a minute. The Indian National Science Academy, popularly known as INSA, plays a major role in establishing international relations with other academies and organizations across the world. Established as National Institute for Sciences in India in 1935, in this very city of Kolkata from where I am speaking. Subsequently, it was moved to New Delhi in 1946 and relocated to the current premises in 1951. The name of the National Institute of Sciences of India was changed to the Indian National Science Academy in 1970. Among its many activities of recognizing excellence in science and communicating emerging issues to the public and the government, INSA gives much importance in recognizing talent in young scientists to nurture them for the future. Today, on the occasion of the award ceremony of the Jawaharlal Nehru Birth Centenary Medal being conferred to Professor Marcia McNutt, I, on behalf of all fellows of INSA, warmly congratulate her. This award was established in the year 1989 by the Academy to commemorate India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru's birth centenary. Scientists from all nations are eligible for consideration for this medal, which carries a plaque and a citation. Some of the previous awardees of this medal include Professor Sunny Bergstrom, Professor Bruce Alberts, Professor Paul Crutzen, Professor Alain Carpentier, and Professor Venkataraman Ramakrishnan, among others. While we wish that we could hear Professor McNutt in person, but for the time being, we have to make do with the virtual platform. However, we fervently hope that we shall also see her in India sometime soon and interact more closely. I will now like to invite Professor N.K. Mehra, Vice President of International Affairs for INSA, for reading out the citation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is my pleasant duty and a very proud duty to now read this very impressive citation. The Indian National Science Academy had instituted the Jawaharlal Nehru Birth Centenary Medal in the birth centenary year 1989 of late Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of independent India. Pandit Nehru was responsible and instrumental for giving a major push to the growth of science and technology in the country. The Jawaharlal Nehru Birth Centenary Medal has been awarded since 1990 for making contributions to international cooperation and public understanding in science and technology. The award is made once in 3 years, and scientists from all nations are eligible for consideration. The award carries a plaque and a citation. It is one of the most prestigious international awards of the Academy, bestowed upon distinguished overseas scientists. And the other scientists in the past have been Carl Sohn Bergstrom in 1990, Sir Michael Atiyah in 1993, Nanakakura in 1996, F. Gross in 1999, Bruce Alberts in 2000, Hubert Markle in 2001, Hubert Kurian in 2003, Yuan T. Lee in 2004, Vladimir Kedishevsky in 2005, Paul Kurtzon in 2006, David King in 2007, Lu Yongxiang in 2010, Elaine Carpentier in 2013, and Venkataraman Ramakrishnan in 2016, and of course, PM Ajayan in 2019. The medal for the year 2022 is being awarded to Professor Marcia McNutt, the President of the US National Academy of Sciences and an accomplished geophysicist. She served as editor-in-chief of the Science family of journals from 2013 to 2016. Professor McNutt was director of the US Geological Survey from 2009 to 2013. Before joining the USGS, she served as the president and chief executive officer of the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute in Moss Landing, California. Dr. McNutt began her academic career at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Boston, where she was the E.A. Griswold Professor of Geophysics. She was the director of the joint program in Oceanography, Applied Ocean Science and Engineering, jointly offered by MIT and the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Our primary research area is the dynamics of the upper mantle and lithosphere on geologic timescales. Professor McNutt served as president of the American Geophysical Union from the year 2000 to 2002. She holds honorary doctorate from the Colorado College, University of Minnesota, Monmouth University, the Colorado School of Mines, University of Miami, Uppsala University, Michigan State University, Worcester Polytechnic Institute, George Washington University, Boston Uni, Texas A&M University, and Indiana University Bloomington. McNutt is a member of the National Academy of Engineering, the American Philosophical Society, and the American Academy of Arts and Science, and a foreign member of the Royal Society UK the Russian Academy of Sciences, and the Chinese Academy of Sciences. She's a fellow of AGU, the Geological Society of America, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, and the International Association of Geodesy. In 1988, she was awarded AGU's Messelwen Medal for Research Accomplishments by a Young Scientist. And she received the Maurice Ebing Medal in 2007 for her contributions to deep sea exploration. Today, Professor McNutt is going to speak on misinformation addressing the challenge. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Professor Meha, for that wonderful citation. And thank you, Professors Shaha and Singhvi, for your warm welcome. It's definitely a pleasure for me to be with you today, especially on this glorious occasion. Receiving from the Indian National Science Academy the Jawaharlal Nehru Birth Centenary Medal is certainly a thrill for me, especially when I hear the distinguished list of previous recipients. I am proud and thrilled to join their ranks. I also lament that I cannot be with you personally today. I am sure it is absolutely lovely in India this evening, but hopefully, indeed, in the near future, I will be able to make the trip and visit you all. So let me start by sharing my screen so we can get going on my lecture today.
Yes, we can see it.
You can see it. Okay, great. And do you see the full thing now? Is it?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. So given that communication is one of the criteria for this medal, I thought it appropriate to talk today about the misinformation and what the problem is and what we can do as scientists and as academies to address the challenge. Now, I don't have to tell you all how rampant misinformation is in our society today. We see it in health, such that people are rejecting scientific advice on how to control and end the pandemic. We see it in the environment. As you heard, I'm a geoscientist, and climate change is one of the top areas where misinformation and disinformation is on the web. And we even see it in war. On the right side of the screen here, I show a tweet that I believe has been taken down, but it was a hoax claiming that the election campaign of Zelensky involved him murdering people with guns, when actually that scene was from a series, Servant of the People, which the president of the Ukraine had been a lead actor in it, but it was portrayed as though that was his actual behavior rather than something in a movie. There are several types of information, and I want to distinguish between them. If you'll see here in this plot, I've outlined 3 different areas with 2 axes. One axis is whether there's an intent to deceive in the upper part of the diagram, or in the lower diagram, no intent to deceive. And then on the horizontal axis, whether the information is misleading or not misleading. Trustworthy information falls in the upper right-hand corner of this plot because it is not misleading information and there's no intent to deceive. That's the sort of information that we want to push out to the public, to decision makers, and to other scientists. Whereas over on to the left of that is information that's misinformation, it's misleading, but there actually wasn't an intent to deceive. Very often those who are spreading misinformation are actually believing that the information they are sharing and advocating to others is actually correct. Whereas in the lower left-hand corner of this diagram is information that is not only misleading, but there's an actual conscious intent to deceive. This is called disinformation, and the purveyors of disinformation usually have a motive in wishing to confuse the issue and make people do things that are often not in their own best interests. Now, the WHO has combined both misinformation and disinformation when they declared there is an infodemic, which is in tandem with the current pandemic. Now, let me talk about one area where disinformation has been rampant. Remember, disinformation is an intent to deceive, and the information is wrong. Disinformation is serious in the case of climate change because it impacts the willingness of science or society to take the mitigating measures required to avoid cascading consequences on a warming planet. I wanted to give you one very specific example of a disinformation campaign that was particularly effective. NASA, the US Space Agency, posted on the web a blog, which actually was not misinformation. It was correct information. In this blog, it discussed what is the sun's role in climate change. And as you can read in this blog, it says correctly that the sun is important to keep the planet warm for us to survive. It also influences Earth's climate. It says, we know subtle changes in Earth's orbit around the sun are responsible for the comings and goings of the past ice ages. But the warming we've seen over the last few decades is too rapid to be linked to changes in Earth's orbit and is too large to be caused by solar activity. So the blog admits that there have been climate changes in the past that were caused by orbital changes and by the sun, but that is not the case with the current rapid warming. Well, what you'll see here in the next slide is that the information in that blog was cherry-picked by people who fear climate or who fear action on climate change. For example, people who might be funded by fossil fuel companies, to say that NASA admits that climate change occurs because of changes in Earth's solar orbit, which was correct, and not because of SUVs and fossil fuels, whereas the statement from NASA did not say that. What was interesting about this blog that was published that was misinformation is that it was the top performing climate content on the web in 2019. It outperformed all of the correct information on climate change. It ended up with 4.2 million impressions, which is the sum of tweets, Facebook shares, Reddit posts, etc. So this is a case where starting with some correct information ended up with a very highly publicized piece of misinformation. And so we asked the question, why did the disinformation perform so well? Well, first of all, it was based on a selective representation of reputable science. Geoscientists know after something called the Milankovitch theory was published, that subtle variations in Earth's orbit, its obliquity, its eccentricity, et cetera, can cause broad, long-scale changes in climate, but are certainly not responsible for the current warming. The corrections to that disinformation did not get the same engagement from the public. It was much more salacious to hear that maybe society might be off the hook in terms of climate change. and it played on readers' bias for not wanting to make changes to their lifestyle. It was easily shared among like-minded social groups that do not include those positioned to debunk the claim. By the time this widely circulated post came to the attention of people who could point out its flaws, it already had gone viral. What should have been red flags to this is it came from a known purveyor of disinformation, an organization called Natural News, which puts up lots of misleading information. There were many fact check corrections to the story that were posted. So anyone who read it with an open mind and might have been suspicious could easily have found corrections to that misinformation had they tried. It contradicted the best science. And as a result of this, search engines are now prioritizing the fact check posting, if you look this up, rather than the original. But unfortunately, the original is still available on the web. So that is indeed a continuing problem. Let me go on to my next topic, which is misinformation regarding COVID treatment. Now, I called the climate change example disinformation because there was clearly a goal by Natural News to deceive the readers. Whereas much of the misinformation regarding COVID treatment, there's not an intent to deceive. Most people don't want to kill other people, but because they are not purveying scientifically accurate information, it does impact the willingness of society to take the mitigating measures required to avoid the worst outcomes from COVID. The case I want to use for COVID is ivermectin, because it was basically the perfect storm of information. There had been a study in particular out of France that was poorly controlled. It was a small sample group, and the study hinted at the possible benefit from ivermectin as a treatment for COVID. But there were no clinical trials. But because the paper was published in a journal, it was hard to distinguish this poorly controlled study from other well-controlled studies that had better solutions to avoiding COVID. What also ended up as a problem was that ivermectin is approved for some human uses, for example, for treating a parasitic worm. And so there was no reason to say offhand that people shouldn't take ivermectin. But for the parasitic worm, people need to get a prescription from their doctor to take it in an appropriate dose. On the other hand, ivermectin is widely available as a dewormer for horses. And so people could actually bypass their physician entirely, go directly to a feed store and get this drug, but in too large a dose. And because of that, there was a surge in overdoses from use of the horse version, and a 24-fold increase in off-label prescriptions that were actually given by doctors, despite there was no FDA approval for ivermectin as a prophylactic against COVID. Courts have typically ruled when there's been challenges to this use of ivermectin that there is no right to an unproved medication. So for example, if a patient is in a hospital and demands that their physician give them ivermectin, the physician doesn't have to comply. But in general, the attitude of the public was, well, how can it hurt to take this drug? Well, it did hurt because of this surge in overdoses. And it honestly didn't help. Because if it's diverting people from proven interventions, such as vaccines and masks, it actually is doing harm. Now, failure to vaccinate, which also occurs thanks to misinformation, causes hospitalizations and deaths. I'm showing here just one example from one of the states in the US, Wisconsin. And there was a study there that was done in Madison of how COVID affects vaccinated and unvaccinated people. Basically, out of every 100,000 fully vaccinated people, just 125 were expected to get COVID, of which 4.9% of those people would actually be hospitalized and 0.1% would die. When you compare that to non-fully vaccinated people, you can see that 3 times as many people are getting the disease. 4 times as many people almost have to be hospitalized, and more than 10 times as many people will actually die from the disease. So there's good evidence that being vaccinated is a very effective treatment. And therefore, the fear of people of getting vaccinated is definitely worrisome. Now, I would say that in the ivermectin case, there was just too much nuance for the public to correctly understand what to do. It pitched doctors who understood the danger of ivermectin against other doctors who felt that it couldn't hurt, and also the FDA in the US. The ease of publication of poorly controlled studies makes off-label use appear to be scientifically defensible, even though it was not a good study. And the other problem is some patients given ivermectin actually did improve, but statistically, some should improve just by chance. Depending on which group you're in, even if you're hospitalized, your chances of not needing great intervention were still like 40%. And so some people given ivermectin would improve even without the treatment and with it. And actually, in the end, no one wins when legitimate debate is prevented. So it was very hard for scientists to come out and say, no, stop all this crap with ivermectin, because it actually is important that different scientists can talk about the evidence and what it shows in the case of ivermectin. Another problem that we have with misinformation is not only the fact that there are these nuances and also groups that are purposely peddling misinformation, but there are so many more channels that it can spread through. For example, with broadcast media and print media, there are generally gatekeepers who limit who can put information of any type on these channels. But now with social media and the web, anyone can post information. And with these much easier channels of communication, we see that misinformation is spreading much more quickly. So as I said, anyone can create content on the web or social media. And actually what's also working against us is the business model for these platform providers. Their success, because they depend on paid advertising, is how many people view and share the content, meaning that the content, if it's going viral, that's a good thing. The social media companies are not incentivized to stop misinformation from sharing. Social science research also shows that the more salacious the content, the more likely it is to be spread. So that's also going against us. Misinformation is generally much more exciting than the real information. And also bad actors know how to prey on readers' preconceived biases to influence their opinions, to harden their positions, and create polarization through the spreading of disinformation. So now, addressing the problem. What is the role for science? So anyone can create content on the web or on social media. So that's a problem that scientists face. The business model is a problem, but if we go through this, scientists can't control what's posted on the web. Scientists can't control the business model for platform providers. Scientists can't control how exciting and thrilling the misinformation is likely to be. And scientists have virtually no control over bad actors who want to prey on readers' preconceived biases. So these are not areas where scientists can do much. Business community, yes. Policymakers, perhaps. But what can scientists do to stop this infodemic? So I'm going to give you some examples of what I think scientists can do. They can first of all start by anticipating how information will be distorted into misinformation or disinformation, and they can anticipate how pre-existing phobias will be amplified. And therefore, when they send out correct information on the web, by anticipating the way it can be misused, they can try to head that off from the beginning. As scientists, we can also educate students of all ages on critical thinking, on how to use healthy skepticism on something that seems too good to be true, and where to go to verify information to determine whether it's disinformation or misinformation. We as scientists need to diversify our own information channels so that we know when misinformation is spreading and can intervene at earlier times. We should be explaining how scientists build trust. I think that too many members of the public assume that science is a list of facts, whereas science is constantly evolving. And when new ideas are proposed, we have ways of verifying and building trust in those new ideas. We have to do a better job at communicating risk, and we have to understand what builds trust in the public in particular. So let me start with that first one, anticipate challenges of how communications will be distorted and how existing phobias will be amplified. So one exercise we did at the National Academy was a science scenario building exercise where we looked at possible futures that we needed to anticipate, dictated by forces beyond our control, and determine what are some no regrets actions. So I show an example of scientific scenario building where we considered two axes that define four possible futures we could be in. One axis is, what does the virus do? Is the virus complex, constantly mutating to more contagious and vaccine-resistant forms? Or is the virus sort of a one and done? We get COVID-19, we understand it, and we build a vaccine to counter it. Now, when we did this scenario building, it was early in the pandemic, and now we know that we're definitely down into these two scenarios. And then we looked at how did society respond to complex challenges? Are vaccines widely available and being used, or does vaccine hesitancy limit uptake? And so what we found was that we are definitely in an area where virus was constantly mutating to more contagious forms, and that vaccine hesitancy, particularly in the US, was limiting uptake. And so in our scenario building, we determined what were some no regrets actions we could take that would help the United States get through the pandemic, given these two sort of worst case scenarios. So that is one approach to anticipation. Now, the second example I wanted to give of what science can do is to educate people in critical thinking skills, healthy skepticism, and resources for verifying. So one approach we took at the National Academy was to launch a video game that people of any age could download from the web. And it was a fun game. It's called Cat Colony Crisis. You can look it up on the web. It's a game in which the scenario in this game is a whole spaceship of cats is headed to a new planet. And on their way, a pandemic breaks out in the spaceship. And the game part of this is the player needs to figure out what to do on this spaceship to get as many of the cats safely and with good health to the other planet. So, of course, the spaceship is analogous to planet Earth. The cats are analogous to us. And the person playing the game is the decision maker who needs to get the cats safely. It's had, at the time I wrote this, it had more than 65,000 downloads and was a great way to educate people in decision-making for proper public health. Okay, my next action that I'm invoking for scientists is to broaden information channels. All of the algorithms on the web, when I open up Facebook or I open up Twitter, they're set to direct to me feeds that reinforce what I like to see. And so these algorithms are forcing us down information channels that more and more reinforce what we already believe and do not direct us to different viewpoints that might help us understand how other people think and believe and where the real issues are. So one thing we did at the National Academy of Sciences was we started a new program that was basically before the pandemic, but also dealing with misinformation, that's called Based on Science. You can easily look up Based on Science on the web. And it was an academy program to fill gaps in authoritative information and present that material in a way to the general public that they will understand. So, for example, we dealt with, we would start with teaming up with the platform providers who would tell us what are search topics that people are constantly looking on the web to get answers to their questions. But when they do, there's only misinformation or disinformation. There's no good information. So an example would be, can sucking lemons cure cancer? Well, most scientists don't take the time to write papers on why sucking lemons is not going to cure cancer. But yet, if there's a lot of misinformation on the web saying that, oh yes, I sucked lemons and my cancer went away, then there's no scientifically defensible place for Google or Bing or the other platform providers to send the person searching for the information. So knowing what were the common search areas where there's no good information, we could then have scientists work with writers to take the valid science and put it in terms, we generally used an 8th grade level of education in conveying the appropriate information. So when COVID happened, that basically expanded this Based on Science into the COVID arena. So for example, answering questions like, can a COVID-19 test tell me how sick I will get? Can a COVID-19 test tell me if I'm contagious? What's the best type of COVID-19 test to get? In other areas for example, climate change, does global warming contribute to extreme weather events? Does ultraviolet light kill coronavirus? And does the flu vaccine affect COVID-19 test results or the likelihood of catching COVID-19? This has been one of the most successful public information campaigns that the Academy has ever had. And many visitors are coming to these sites to get accurate information. This just shows up to September of last year, the kind of traffic on Google that came to this site, as many as 2 million people per month coming to get this, this information. My fourth on my list was to communicate how scientists determine what to trust. The analogy I'd like to use for this is a giant game of Jenga. And I don't know how popular Jenga is in India, but it's a game where one can stack up a tower of 2x4s, all of the same length, crisscrossed. And then the trick is to see if you can pull out one of these 2x4s from this tower without making it fall. And my analogy with science is that the scientific method is like the base of the Jenga game. Scientists trust the scientific method as the most proven, self-correcting approach for revealing the laws of governing the natural world. So we communicate that scientists trust the scientific method. And the top of the giant Jenga game is the scientific consensus. And this consensus is achieved on the foundation of all these 2x4s, which are the individual studies which support the scientific consensus. Now, if scientists start believing that some of these studies are not trustworthy, it's like pulling out one of these 2x4s in the stack, as studies are found to be unreliable or falsified or in some way not trustworthy. And scientists are always skeptical of any individual study. An individual study is just a suggestion of what might be a scientific truth until it is verified and until it stands the test of time. And if too many of these individual studies are proven to be untrustworthy and pulled out of this stack, then the scientific consensus falls. And we call that a paradigm shift. And a new scientific consensus will be built on a new tower on new, more trustworthy studies. So I think that this sort of analogy helps communicate to people that individual studies are not trustworthy, but scientists always trust the scientific method and they trust the scientific consensus unless too many studies supporting it are found to be unreliable. So another project that the Academy started to try to convey to people that science is a way of knowing, it's not a list of facts, is a web-based project we put up called The Science Behind It. And what The Science Behind It tries to do is educate people on not only what do scientists trust as the consensus, but how did they come to that understanding? What was the process and what were the studies that were verified and contributed to this consensus? So it teaches science as a process. And the sorts of topics we used to illustrate science as a way of knowing were PTSD, which is a condition that soldiers get where they're a mental health problem when they come back from war, climate change, human flight to Mars, dementia, women in science, immigration, forensic science, cybersecurity, the origin of the universe, space weather, 3D printing, how science is trustworthy, the cloud, climate and weather, and cost of drugs, among other topics. The fifth on my list was to find better ways to communicate risks. Anecdotes are not data. So, for example, in the Ivermectin case, if 40% of hospitalized people who are unvaccinated are going to get better anyway, just because someone took ivermectin and improved doesn't mean that it is a scientifically proven treatment. This is an example of a risk matrix that came out of NOAA, which I really like, because it talks about, on one axis, what's the likelihood of something happening, and then on this axis, how dangerous is that outcome? So clearly, there's highest risk when the likelihood of happening is very high, and when if it does occur, what the consequences will be are very dangerous, such as fatality, major, injury, lost time for an accident, etc. And so these are the risk areas that need special communication. One example, let me talk about these guidelines for risk communication. You have to this also came out of NOAA, to make an informed plan, speak to the audience's interests, not yours. They aren't going to be motivated because of what's happening to you. They're going to be motivated by what happens to them. Explain the risk using stories and visuals to make the case clear. This can be very difficult when an event has no precedence, such as the current pandemic. Offer options to reduce the risk. Work with trusted sources and trusted messengers. The messenger is as important as the message. Test your message on the intended audience before you put it out. Find out what the holes are, the gaps, how it could backfire, and use multiple channels to communicate. Don't just put it on television, or don't just put it on a Facebook page. Try to use all methods of communication. And one example of a very concerning risk communication from the National Weather Service was when Hurricane Harvey hit the Gulf Coast of Texas in 2017 and became stalled right at the coastline. The words that the National Weather Service used were quite motivating. They said locations may be uninhabitable for weeks or months, and that all impacts are unknown and beyond anything experienced. And here's just a picture of the aftermath of Harvey. I calculated at one point that the rainfall going in to Houston, which is basically is a very flat part of the US, there's no high ground there, was equivalent to the flow of 13 Mississippis being dumped into that city over over several days. And my sixth on my list is to build trust in science by being trustworthy. Scientists who study trust show us that there are actually two dimensions of trust. One is how competent is the professional, and secondly, the second dimension is warmth. How much do people feel like the professional is working in their best interests? And as you can see in this red box, engineers, scientists, and doctors tend to max out the scale on competence. The public thinks we're competent, but in terms of how much they believe we're working in their best interests, we're just kind of middle of the road here. Childcare workers and teachers and nurses are much more likely to be viewed as working in the person's best interests. And for that reason, we have to get out of our scientific silos and build warmth and trust by communicating more to people of how we understand what their challenges are and how we're working to help make their lives better. So this brings up the need to bridge the two worlds. Science as practiced, as we're all taught as scientists, that a result is only worth publishing if it's a major advancement on or an overturn of accepted scientific views. And so we actually want to show how what we're doing is different than what was published. Originality is what we're after. Whereas consistent messaging would reduce confusion. Many are taught as science as an internal body of facts. And if we're always emphasizing how our results differ from anything that came before, we can confuse the public. We're also taught to remain dispassionate. The result should not depend on which scientist did the analysis. It should be a universal truth. Whereas for the public, scientists and their story are interesting. They want to hear what motivated us to do the study. They want to hear what challenges we faced. And science as practiced, all caveats and uncertainties are included. That's the way we show what the limitation is of our work and what are other areas that need to be properly investigated. Whereas uncertainty makes the public think that scientists don't know what they're doing. So we have to find ways to bridge these two worlds that is scientifically valid, but yet doesn't confuse the public. The National Academy, in terms of trying to understand how we can make science more trustworthy, published this report a few years ago on fostering integrity in research. And one of the recommendations, they had recommendations for journals, for authors, and for scientists, but they also recommended that some organization should establish a research integrity advisory board to become an organizational focus for best practices and standards to raise the integrity of science and make it more trustworthy. Now, in response to that, the National Academy of Sciences stepped up to the challenge and created something that we're calling the Strategic Council for Research Excellence, Integrity, and Trust. It is charged with advancing overall health, quality, and effectiveness of the research enterprise, and includes all domains that fund, execute, disseminate, and apply scientific work for the in the public interest. So, for example, federal agencies that fund research, research institutions that actually do the work, journals that disseminate it, and also policymakers who ultimately use that science. This strategic council is identifying challenges to excellence and trust in science. It's articulating principles and best practices, and it's coordinating collaborative action across the entire enterprise, from the funders to the actual users of the research, and removing barriers to accelerate solutions. Some examples of some possible initial issues that we're addressing are conflict of interest. How can we reduce the burden while becoming more complete and transparent in what we disclose? The question of measuring impact. As we hire and promote researchers, what should we count in terms of the impact of their work? We all know that there are shortcomings in counting things like numbers of publications or citations in terms of driving behavior that may not be productive. And then also another topic is correcting the record. How can we be transparent, fast, and fair all at the same time by making sure that flawed science does not continue to mislead people? So with that, I will end. Here's just our building in Washington, D.C. and the famous Einstein statue out front. And I'll end with this quote from David Gray at Oxford University, who said, "Science without policy is still science, but policy without science is gambling." So thank you all very much for your time today, and especially thank you for this lovely medal. I am thrilled and honored today. Thank you.
Dr. Singhvi, you are on mute. Kindly
Yes.
unmute yourself.
Please unmute yourself.
I'm sorry. Thanks for a very fascinating lecture that would require about a day's discussion on every single slide that you have talked about. I would request Professor Shaha to ask any question if she has. Otherwise, as the custom demands, we will move on to the panel discussion and we'll take the questions at the end of the panel discussion. Professor Shaha, how do we proceed?
I think we could go to the panel discussion, and at the end,
Okay.
collectively we can have the questions.
Collectively discuss it. Okay. So I will introduce briefly the panel discussion, the rationale behind it, and then we will request the panelists to share their comments. A warm welcome to this panel discussion on changing narratives of science, technology, innovation, economics, ethics, and society. Issues and challenging in recalibrating the academics and the academies. Friends, we are in very difficult times, in a very difficult world, and you have heard recently, just now, the kind of challenges we face. We are in times of limitless miseries, increasing calamities due to melting poles, rising sea level, forest fires to the pandemic, and the dangers from international fights on one pretext or the other to control the resources that are very rare on the earth. The list is long, but it's fact that the entire concept of global village for global good for all stands compromised due to sectarian considerations. The entropy of everything in the world is increasing, be it social behavior or intolerance or the disparities in economic well-being, with very few getting very rich at the cost of all of the rest. The distance between educated and uneducated is increasing. The gap between hope and despair is widening every day by the minute. Extreme stripes arising from the concern of future of jobs is around the corner, and this spells a future of violence and pain. People will struggle to get jobs in the future. The decision making at all levels is increasingly becoming complex due to either ether-like half-truths and half-knowledge. This becomes more complex due to varied confirmational and disconfirmational biases. Added to it is the misinformation and misguided confidence of all those in the decision making who sit at the crest of the bound stupid in the Daniel Kruger curve. Social media is more abused, misused than used. You just heard the case. Based on fake WhatsApp messages, people react instantly, create social cues and ruckus, and in the process, critical thinking, logic, reason, human dignity are all put in the backyard. Fakery is the norm. It's scary, but true. We've also seen on one hand that science is increasingly deployed by the society to help it, be it the fight with pandemic, the climate change, the food security, the nutrition, and the like. At the same time, science and scientists face an ever-increasing deficit of trust in it. Extended and protected discussion on climate change denials, vaccine hesitancies are cases which show the kind of trust deficit science has. And the policymakers are increasingly providing a mixed response to scientific advice only to service their immediate concerns and constituencies. These responses range from blatant denials of scientific evidence, abject ridicule of the data and evidences thereof, the reluctance to fund science with vigor, and innocent recourse to ignorance of citizens. I will only say all my citizens are ignorant, so what can I do? But this is not the case. This approach subverts the very process of science And I think we need to guard against it. We must remain, it's certain that our policymakers want to remain clean always. Everything else has to be taken care of the scientists. Good, bad, worse is our problem. And at at our own level, we need to introspect how well we are able to communicate our thoughts and our sciences. There's also an issue of creation of classes in the system. The new classes are being created, one with the web access, another without it, and most are without it. The long-term impact of these will have a variety of educations, varied education systems for those with web and without web. And this is security of the people. And this is a worrisome prospect, again, which may lead to violence and joblessness. These disparities will increase with the passage of time. We need to think of how we can cross the Brent line of North versus South, and how we make South as an active beneficiary of global well-being, happiness, hope, and dignity. Some years ago, Professor Boulton wrote an article, "What are the universities for?" And today, possibly we can ask a similar question, what are the academies for? What are the academics for? And what role can they play and should play in bringing down the global entropy, enhance sanity, and make world a more congenial and a safer place for all? So $1 million question is, what can we do and how should we do to serve the motto of science, to seek the truth for the well-being of all? I recall that in his book, Discovery of India, Pandit Nehru in 1940s explicitly talked about scientific temper, humanism, and scientist social responsibility. The present global context makes these remarks very appropriate. And we need to think and reinvent what he said 50 or 70 years ago. I do feel, actually, we all feel privileged today that we have honored him in our own way through this award and a very elegant lecture. I'll now briefly introduce the panelists so that you know who we are talking to and whom we are listening to. The first is Professor Geoffrey Boulton, a globally acclaimed glacial geologist for his work on how ice sheets create landscapes. He is a rare worker who combines field observations, laboratory study with mathematical modeling to understand the way in which the past ice sheet behaved and how the modern glaciers would interact with the beds of they traverse on. He is on the governing board of the International Science Council and is representing the International Science Council here today. He has been decorated with the Order of the British Empire, besides the Fellowship of the Royal Societies of London and Edinburgh. He has many other awards to his credit, and his article, "What the Universities Are For," has been internationally acclaimed, widely used, and is a treat to read. I couldn't leave it when I started reading it. He recently authored a book, the ISC book on science as public good, a title that is also the vision of ISC. So he has written the vision document of the ISC. The next speaker is Professor Naomi Oreskes, is a professor of history of science and earth sciences at Harvard University, and has been a leading voice in the role of science in society and the reality of Anthropocene climate change. Her 7 books include Merchants of Doubt, Why Trust Science, and more. A Google search gave me 178 million hits on our book, The Merchant of Doubt, and only 78 million on the other titles. You can imagine the kind of reach she has. Her new book, The Magic of Marketplace, The True History of a False Idea, should be out soon, and I hope to reserve a copy for myself today. She has been variously honored by the Geological Society of America, the AGU Presidential Citation for Science and Society, and is a fellow of the American Association of Advancement of Science, AAAS, and APS, American Philosophical Society. The next speaker is Professor Holden Thorp, who had his early education at the University of North Carolina, then moved to Caltech and Yale. He has served as the Chancellor of the University of North Carolina and as a provost and distinguished professor at the Washington University of St. Louis, with twin appointments in chemistry and medicine. Shows how expert he is in two subjects. Since 2019, he is editor-in-chief of Science Journal and has been writing very thought-provoking articles, such as why hyping science is a crime, public debate is good for science, miscommunication, it's not easy as it looks, looking ahead and looking back. I read almost every single article he writes in Science. It only amazes me how he manages to convey all he wants in one page. Precisely, he ends at the last corner of the right side. His last word will be, so it's an art that he has, and I compliment him for this. He's a fellow of the National Academy of Inventors, has written 2 acclaimed books on higher education, engines of innovation, and the 21st century and our calling, rebuilding partnership with America, its colleges and universities. His Google hits are of the order of 1 million and 2 million. Professor Shaha is a chemical biologist and is acclaimed for work on cell death programs in various organisms and the processes that lead to it. She has served on many commissions, ranging from genetics to genome analysis to male fertility and to contraceptions. Her early education was in Indian Institute of Chemical Biology at Hyderabad. Then she worked at the Universities of Kansas, the New York Population Council, before taking over as the director and professor of eminence at the National Institute of Immunology. She has the unique honor of being the first female president of the Indian National Science Academy, and she has done it with a rare aplomb. She is a fellow of the Third World Academy of Sciences and a recipient of Renbexy Award, J.C. Bose National Fellowship, Bhatnagar Prize, to name a few. And above all, I must personally thank her for the honor she has given me of hosting this prestigious event. Marcia McNutt has already been introduced, and it's a rare honor for the International Science Academy to have the president of the US Academy address its fellowship. Welcome again, Professor McNutt. It has been a rare pleasure for me to introduce all these external personalities, and I'm sure we are all in an intellectual feat. May I now request for opening remarks by the panelists, and we'll follow these with a certain amount of discussion, including those in chat box, which I request Professor Marcia to read in between. And the sequence will be remarks by Professor Boulton, Professor Oreskes, Professor Thorp, Professor Shaha, and Professor Marcia. I put Dr. Marcia at the last because she'll have time to breathe somewhat after a long 1 hour long lecture. So over to Professor Boulton.
Thank you very much, Professor Singhvi, and good day, everyone. Well, I take my lead from Professor Singhvi's introduction, but rather than answering his difficult questions directly, I'll try to go back to basics where some of the answers may lie, and we'll talk about recalibrating science, its institutions and its processes. And I'm glad to say I'll also intersect at several points with Marcia's excellent lecture. Science has long ceased to be a dispensable luxury. It's become essential to the support and advancement of our societies. So getting science right matters. But its utility shouldn't only be seen through the limited lens of demand. It enriches human perspectives in ways that can't be captured on a balance sheet and in ways that are profoundly enticing to the human imagination. It's also important to distinguish between two major modes of science in serving the public good. The first is that the science that's needed to respond to immediate or predictable needs, where we need to ensure a powerful demand-side pull at both national and global levels, and ensure that incentives and interfaces work efficiently and effectively. Equally, there are phenomena that we don't understand and may not even know about, that have major implications for society and only come to light through unconstrained exploration beyond the bounds of current understanding. 50 years ago, university scientists who studied climate change had long hair and wore brightly colored socks. We were regarded as irrelevant, but harmless. But serendipitous investment in our work revealed processes that now are recognized as threatening the future of human society. So whilst mission-driven research is vital for immediate and foreseeable priorities, enlarging the breadth of human understanding through curiosity-driven inquiry is a vital investment in an unknowable future. Open democratic societies are built on and serve the capacities and needs of their citizens, and they need strong, self-motivated and independent or quasi-independent institutions. In science, key ones are academies and universities. Bob May, a former president of the Royal Society, characterized academies at their worst as being 90% gonad, spending most of their energies in self-reproduction. At their best, they speak up for science as a special form of knowledge. They explore and disseminate the implications of scientific discovery to wider publics and work to inform the need for and the creation of public policy. Universities have a different role. They've become the great creative centers of the modern world. Although their forms, structures, and avowed purposes vary greatly, from the specialized to the comprehensive, most embody at their core durable common values. Universities research into the most intractable uncertainties of knowledge, and yet they also seek the practical application of discovery. They create, test, and invigorate the inherited knowledge of earlier generations and seek to establish sound principles of reasoning and action. Their students learn not to be dismayed by complexity, but to be capable and daring in unraveling it, and learn to distinguish between the true and the merely seemingly true, vital skills in the modern world of the internet. In the words of the Nigerian poet Ben Okri, the role of a university is to set up its student for the act of self-discovery. But if indeed your principal purpose is to wring financial value from the new knowledge that is created in universities, it's not their spin-out companies that yield the greatest value, but the flux of graduates equipped with new knowledge and ideas that annually move into a great diversity of roles in society. Get the people right and an open environment in which to deploy their skills and to make mistakes, and all else follows. Governmental perceptions of universities as potential dynamos of economic growth, through their research in particular, has over the last 50 years shifted the focus of much university effort away from teaching and towards research, with bibliometric indices being used as proxy measures of excellence. One of its consequences has been an enormous growth in the production of research papers, a large proportion of which, in my view at least, are of little value, and which subtract from the effort that should go into the education of the rising generation. It's a prime example, equally true of university league tables, of Goodhart's law that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure, or you get what you measure. It's a system with perverse consequences that is in serious need of reform. As has been mentioned, the International Science Council has a vision of science as a global public good. It's a vision with profound implications for the ways that science is conducted and used, and the responsibilities it imposes on scientists. The concept of shared public goods has been a concern of moral and political philosophers since ancient times and in many cultures. It contrasts pursuit of the good of the many with the pursuit of narrow self-interest. Such goods have no market value, but they're the basis for most private goods. Knowledge is the most powerful of public goods. It's been the inspiration and agent upon which most human, material, social and personal progress has been built. Science is a special form of knowledge, a formalized approach that has two fundamental attributes, which are the source of its value as a global public good. Firstly, that knowledge claims and the evidence on which they're based are made openly available to be tested against reality and logic through the scrutiny of peers. And secondly, that the results of scientific inquiry are communicated promptly into the public sphere and circulated efficiently to maximize their availability to all who may wish or need to access them. So let me address these two issues in a little more detail. One of the less widely understood aspects of science is that scientific knowledge is provisional, though its various conclusions or theories vary in the level of confidence that can be placed upon them. We can invalidate, but we can't validate. In a phrase that's often attributed to Albert Einstein, 1,000 experiments cannot prove me right, but one experiment can prove me wrong. And in the words of Bertolt Brecht, the aim of science is not to open the door to infinite wisdom, but to set a limit to infinite error. Science flourishes most and is of greatest practical benefit to society when it has untrammeled freedom to speculate, a freedom that's only granted in open societies. To quote Richard Feynman, great American physicist, I would rather have questions that can't be answered rather than answers that can't be questioned. Whilst Jacob Bronowski, most of whose family died in the gas ovens of Auschwitz, commented in a BBC television programme entitled The Ascent of Man, whilst standing in a pool at Auschwitz into which human remains had been flushed, that when people believe that they have absolute knowledge with no test in reality, this is how they behave. This is not to claim any ethical superiority for the method of science. It is practical and effective, but ethically neutral. What you choose to study, the integrity and rigor of your research process, and how the results are used are not. The other major issue that determines the utility of scientific knowledge is the way that it's disseminated. Publishing has lain at the core of the scientific enterprise for more than 3 centuries. By enabling ideas to circulate rapidly between distant readers, it catalyzed a creative chain reaction that triggered an explosion of knowledge. The efficiency and the effectiveness of scientific publication is not therefore a peripheral issue, but critical to the present and the future of science. The current commercially dominated model of science publishing falls far short of serving the needs of science for efficient, effective, and equitable dissemination. And there's a growing demand for reform within the scientific community, although this must confront the fact that the habits of the community itself are complicit in impeding reform. But without reform, for example, the UNESCO recommendation for open science will remain unachievable. The social organization of the scientific effort has evolved greatly over the last 75 years. In its contemporary state, it increasingly recognizes that knowledge production, if it's to be effective in dealing with complex challenges, must be socially distributed, responsive to societal needs, transdisciplinary, and subject to multiple accountabilities. The implied social contract for science is shifting to one in which science is open to society, transparent, and participative. The open science movement is the contemporary manifestation of this progressive evolution. Although the benefits of open science have largely been matters of conjecture, the global scientific response to the COVID-19 pandemic has been a powerful example of open science in action. A wide variety of scientists creatively deployed and applied their knowledge, produced databases and websites, short-circuited the cumbersome processes of conventional publication, and shared data and ideas with unprecedented openness and across the public-private interface. They've done so in ways that set aside conventional constraints and ruthlessly expose some of the processes that inhibit the effectiveness of science in contributing to the public good. The director of the US National Institute of Health commented, "I've never seen anything like this. The phenomenal effort will change science and scientists forever." So, will this indeed be the new normal? Or will science be allowed to retreat to its old ways, to the more restrictive norms of much conventional scientific inquiry? Thank you.
It's a wonderful exposition, very crisp, to enjoyed a lot. May I invite Professor Naomi Oreskes?
Yes, thank you so much. Well, first of all, let me congratulate Dr. McNutt for both this great honor today and the amazing, glittering, stellar career that has led to it. And Marcia, I just want to say personally, you have been an inspiration to many women who have followed in your footsteps. And I think that's important to say here today. I also want to say thank you to the Indian Academy for inviting me to participate in this wonderful day. So what I'd like to do is to step back and talk a little bit about the mental model that I think has framed a lot of our thinking in the scientific community about our relationship to the public that we serve, but that I think, in my view, and based on my research, has also contributed to our difficulties. And it's what I call the supply side model of science. So what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that we have a model that our job, our role, is to supply scientific information, and we assume then that people and policymakers will accept and use it. I think we've seen very clearly in the last decade or more that the supply side model does not work. Dr. McNutt has just given us several very clear examples of places in which it has not fully worked. There are many areas where our scientific understandings are not reflected in either public policy or in public behavior. The three areas that I and other colleagues have studied closely are evolutionary theory, climate change, and vaccines. And some of us were studying vaccine resistance well before COVID-19. But there are many other areas, but these are probably the three most well-studied and perhaps most consequential. The supply side model assumes several things. First, it assumes that people understand what we are saying. Second, it assumes that people want to hear what we are saying. And third, it assumes that we're working on a level playing field. Often, at least one of these is not true, and sometimes none is true. So how do we address this? And we all know that if the assumptions built into our models are wrong, then the model will likely not predict what will actually happen in the world. And I think that's part of what's happened to us in science in the last 30 years or so. So let's look first at the assumption that people understand what we're saying. The obvious solution to that is communication. We have to do more to educate people. Here, I think the scientific community has made huge strides in the last 30 years. I think I've witnessed enormous changes in how we communicate, how we take communication seriously, particularly in the last decade. And I think that we've done fairly well. And I think the recent academy initiatives that Dr. McNutt has just told us about are extremely welcome, and they seem to be very well thought through. So I want to really acknowledge that. But I also want to underscore something else that Dr. McNutt said that I think that most of us have not really taken on board. And I'm going to talk about the United States because it's the area I've studied most closely, but similar patterns are true in many other places. In the United States, the average American's scientific education stopped at high school chemistry. So that means that if we want to speak to ordinary people, we have to use language, terminology, metaphors that make sense to a person who has not learned science past high school chemistry. Most of us don't do that. And if we speak to our colleagues and we try to explain that this is the case, a lot of our colleagues get really upset. And they'll say things like, I don't know how to talk about science to people whose education stopped in high school chemistry. So we have to learn how to do that. Also, again, as Marcia emphasized, communication is as much about style as it is about substance. Anyone who's worked in Hollywood or advertising or marketing will tell you that this is very hard for us to swallow. We have been trained, we have been educated, and we have worked our hearts out to learn so much substance, and we want to convey that substance to people. But often, well, I would say always, substance by itself is never enough. How we appear, how we come across, these are all extremely important to our audiences. And as Marcia said, we know from scientific research, from social scientific research, that telling our personal stories, revealing something of ourselves, helps in communication. But we have trouble with that because it stands in tension with our mental model that we're supposed to efface ourselves, be dispassionate, that science should be unemotional. The second assumption, and here I'm going to go from kind of difficult to worse. So the second assumption is that people want to hear what we're saying. This is often not true. Often we are carrying news that many people receive as bad news. Now, this is much more difficult to accept because it's tied up with politics, with ideology, and religion, all of which are delicate and difficult topics, especially for scientists, because we don't want science to be political, and we especially don't want it to be politicized. We don't want, many of us went into science because we didn't like politics or we weren't interested in it, or we saw it as dirty or difficult. And we aren't trained to think through political questions or even to analyze political information. And it's also risky because if we do engage with the political dimensions, we can be accused of politicizing the science, even if what we're doing is a response to other people who have politicized it. But like it or not, sometimes our work has political implications or perceived implications, and those implications have very, very big consequences for how people receive our work. This is what I and my colleagues have referred to as implicatory denial. People reject scientific information when they don't like its either real or perceived implications. And we have very strong evidence of this in the area of climate change. Much of my work for nearly 20 years now has been about the ideologically motivated resistance to accepting scientific information, typically tied to political commitments to free market economics. This resistance also works, again, as Marcia emphasized, because it plays into and is reinforced by a broad, widespread resistance of virtually all people to change. Again, social science research shows us people don't like change. They often experience change or they fear change as loss, even if it might actually be good for them in the long run. So we have to address those concerns because they're influencing how people are viewing what we're trying to say to them. It's difficult work, but it's necessary. And the third is the issue of the level playing field. And that assumption of all the assumptions we make, that's the one that's, I would say, most incorrect because it's not even close. Marcia usefully distinguished between misinformation and disinformation. Misinformation is a mistake. People make honest mistakes all the time, and often honest mistakes can be corrected by well-crafted messages delivered in a warm and friendly way by trusted messengers. Disinformation is different. Disinformation is deliberate. We face both, but I think that disinformation is the harder challenge because it's much more difficult to counter. In climate change, we have faced more than 3 decades of documented, deliberate disinformation, and it has been extremely well funded. In some cases, we can demonstrate that it has been more well funded than the science it's trying to undermine. And I'll just give one brief example of this. Probably must have been about 10 or 12 years ago, I was part of a panel discussion at the American Geophysical Union with Jane Lubchenco. Jane gave a great feel-good talk about this really wonderful program that she was involved in called the Aldo Leopold program, which was specifically to address my assumption number one, about the issue about communication and to teach scientists how to be better communicators to the general public. It's a lovely program. It's done a lot of good. I got up after Jane and said, okay, well, that was the feel-good story. Now I'm going to give you the feel-bad story because I want to ask what was the budget for that program? And Jane told me, and I went on to discuss a disinformation program funded in this case by the tobacco industry, whose budget was 10 times the budget that Jane had. So what do we do? These are difficult problems, but we're smart people, we're scientists, we embrace difficult challenges. So the first is obvious, we continue to educate. Education is absolutely important. My arguments about these other components are by no means meant to imply that education is not essential. It is. But we also need to acknowledge that there often are political implications to our work. But the concerns can often be addressed. So for example, in the case of climate change, if we're speaking with audiences who have concerns about the economic implications, we can discuss the ways in which climate change can be addressed through market mechanisms, or we can discuss the economic opportunities that exist in a renewable energy economy. Right now in the United States, very few Americans know that green energy is the fastest growing sector of the American economy. Now, the other thing we can do is that sometimes the implications are more perceived than real. And this is particularly true in the area of evolutionary biology. We have a lot of data from social surveys and public opinion polls that people who reject evolutionary theory often do so because they think that it means that there is no God. Or they think that scientists are telling that because life comes about through random processes, that therefore life is random and has no meaning. Well, of course, neither of those is true. Evolution does not tell us whether or not there is a God. And the meaning of life is a philosophical and theological and philosophical question that cannot be answered by evolutionary theory. And we have, again, social science research that shows that if we talk to our students about this, and particularly if we give them readings by scientists who are themselves people of faith, we can counter that wrong perceived implication. And then finally, about deliberate disinformation. Well, this is clearly the hardest one, but there are some solutions. And one of the things we know can work is to call out deliberate disinformation for what it is. Social science research, and here I'm thinking particularly about the work of John Cook on what he calls inoculation. So this is information inoculation, but based on the model of vaccines, shows that when you explain to people that disinformation is disinformation, and when you explain how it works, that helps inoculate people against its effects. So I want to close by saying that I think that what all of this points to, at least in part, is that we need to take more seriously how the social sciences can help. When Marcia was talking about the role for science, many of the things she said, well, this isn't the role of science, but actually I would say it's not the role of natural science, but it may be the role of social science. Social sciences can answer, or at least help to answer, many of these questions about how to communicate effectively, how we build bonds of trust, why people sometimes draw implications from theories that are not, in fact, correct, and what science does and doesn't actually do. Social sciences can help us know how to communicate risk, how to build trust, and especially, and this is what I've worked on for 35 years now, how science actually operates. One of the sad things in my life is that I often hear scientific colleagues say things about how science operates that are not actually true. So we're actually conveying misinformation about our own work, and that really needs to be fixed. So I'll just end with one last thing, a piece of good news. Always good to end with good news. All communications people will tell you that. Don't leave your audience depressed. So just yesterday, I saw a call from the National Science Foundation in the United States for research working to incorporate human behavior into epidemiological models. We have all seen so clearly this last 2 years that if we don't consider human behavior, we will not get the outcome we want. We have seen how essential this work is. The sad thing, though, is that this work should have been done before the pandemic broke. So in short, to combat both misinformation and disinformation, we need better integration of the natural and social sciences. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very clear exposition. And you compliment what Marcia said so elegantly. May I request Professor Holden Thorp now?
Yes, hello everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Very good, loud and clear.
Okay, good. It's great to be with you all. Thanks. Congratulations to Marcia on this extraordinary honor. Very deserved. As Dr. Oreskes said, she's an inspiration to all of us, and I'm one of the best beneficiaries because I have the privilege of following Marcia as the science editor, and I benefit from all of the outstanding decisions that she made when she was in my role. And she is beloved by all of my colleagues, and we are very appreciative of everything that Marcia has done, and congratulations to you all on recognizing her. Thanks for the kind comments about my editorials. As Marcia and I both know, we both benefited from an outstanding editor, and it's a good reminder that people who are good at editing and communicating are just as important as the people who are doing the science, and we don't do a good enough job of celebrating them. And that would be my editor is very modest, so I'm not going to say her name, but she is outstanding, and we need more people like her in science, that's for sure. The supply side model is a great framing for this, and so I thank Naomi for outlining that in such a great way. I'm going to build on that even more and acknowledge what Marcia said, that one of the things we have to do is accept the things we can't change. We can't change the fact that Facebook promotes misinformation and makes money doing so. We can't change the fact that there are so many forces that are better at using these tools than we are that want to undermine us. We have to focus on the things that we can change. And I think Marcia did a great job of that in her lecture. I want to focus even more on something that Naomi brought out, which is that this all happens in a political environment. And we have been, in my view, science has been a little too timid about acknowledging the fact that politics, as Dr. Oreskes just said, plays a very important role in everything that happens. And I will also focus on the United States, but this can be extrapolated to any country. The history of science and politics in the United States had a very big event in 1945 when Vannevar Bush wrote a paper that led to the formation of the federally funded scientific enterprise in the United States. And scientists have misrepresented, in a way, what he was doing by saying that he was making this extraordinary case for basic research. He was, but he was doing it in a very, very political way. He was a friend of FDR's. He was a political actor. His paper is a political persuasion document. Yes, it's about science, but it takes advantage of a lot of the ideas that have come out here. And so to pretend like it wasn't political is a misrepresentation of that. And the historian Audra Wolfe wrote a great book about this called Freedom's Laboratory, if you want to read more about that. Closer to our current era, I'll also invoke Jane Lubchenco, who is such a great leader on so many of these topics for us all, who was part of a famous story that I've heard directly from her, so this isn't secondhand, where she and Sherry Rowland and Mario Molina went to see Newt Gingrich to talk to him about climate change when Bill Clinton was the president. And you know, these are three highly distinguished, knowledgeable people. Went to see Speaker Gingrich, explained to him what was going on with climate change. And he said, that makes sense. I understand what you're saying. The science, I trust you that the science is correct, but I can't do anything that's the same thing as what Al Gore is doing. And to me, this is a very, very illustrative story, because there's all this hand-wringing that goes on about how science is politicized and that it's somehow our fault. Well, it's not. We operate in a two-party system that's adversarial. And if one side picks science, the other side is going to pick anti-science. And the fact that Newt Gingrich said, yeah, I get the science, but I'm not going there because Al Gore, I can't agree with Al Gore, tells you, you know, what another thing that we can't change, which is for evolution and climate change and all the topics that have come up so far in vaccines. They're politicized intrinsically by the system, not by us. Once one side picks something, the other side's going to pick the other. There's a picture that goes around Twitter of Laura Ingraham on Fox News saying when there were only 500 COVID cases that liberals were trying to scare the world about COVID. And in America, that COVID was politicized right there from that very moment. And yesterday, the governor of Florida told a bunch of high school students to take their masks off because it was COVID theater, and was caught on microphone doing so. So that has been the political part of this was fixed. There's nothing we could have done to stop COVID from being politicized in the way that it has. If you want another illustration of this, you know, there's a great book by Turner and Eisenberg called The Republican Reversal that talks about the fact that, you know, Richard Nixon and Barry Goldwater were environmentalists. But when Reagan became president, the polling showed him that it would be good to undermine the environment. And he began undermining the environment, probably not because he disagreed with the science, but because he knew that that was something useful for him politically. You know, so so that's all pretty stark. But I think that we would be naive to continue to try to pretend that there's a way to be bipartisan and not get sucked into politics if we want to fix all these things. We have a tradition in America of trying to be nice to both parties because we want them to appropriate more money for scientific research. But right now we're paying the price for the fact that we haven't stood up for a lot of what we believe in, and have kind of gotten ourselves wrapped in knots by the fact that we're always trying to do what it takes to get the money rather than standing up for our values. And we have a really complicated discussion that we need to have about what to do about that. What's the good news? Well, science, as has been said, is a human process done by human beings who have all the same flaws that human beings have when they're doing anything else. That's what makes my job interesting. And I agree with everything that's been said about how we need to do a better job of explaining that. And one upshot of it is, sometimes you hear people say, oh, well, there's a scientific cabal to scare everybody about whatever, climate change or COVID. But as Marcia pointed out adroitly in her lecture, the best way to get a paper in a journal like Science is to prove somebody else wrong. And so there can't, because scientists have ego, and we like to prove other people to be incorrect. And so there can't be a cabal to scare people, because if there was a way to prove that one of these things was wrong, every scientist would love to do that. And if they sent it to our journal, we'd probably publish it if we thought it was correct. And that's a feature, a human feature of science that's actually good, because it leads to the honorably self-correcting nature of science. And I think the other piece of good news is that whereas I think a lot of those of us who've been around a long time have de-emphasized science communication and being upfront about the political implications of it all, I think our younger colleagues are much more comfortable acknowledging the breadth of skills that we need in science. And I'm very optimistic that they will lead us to a better future if we'll hurry up and put them in charge. And I think we need to do that as quickly as we can. So thank you very much for including me today. It's a great panel, and I'm happy to be able to talk to you all.
One question that you may answer subsequently. Will there be a change in the philosophy of science, the way it is being running? Well, when we come to, but may I right now I request Professor Shaha for her comments. Professor Shaha?
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Singhvi. Before I start, I would like to congratulate Professor McNutt for such an elegant lecture and showing us how the National Academy of Sciences responded to the issue of misinformation to society. I would also like to thank Professor Boulton, Professor Oreskes, and Professor Thorp for their views. I would like to provide a short opinion on how predatory publishing has led to generation of difficult to identify misinformation and its detrimental effect on various stakeholders. We are aware that predatory practices through scientific journals and predatory conferences even are causing deep problems to the scientific community. However, many of our colleagues are not aware about the misinformation on predatory journals. These practices misleads inexperienced as well as sometimes experienced researchers, and they err in judging the value of scientific data. So that has become a real problem. And there is a huge change of behavior of scientific community thrust upon by the changing age of communication. This is about the mental model that Dr. Oreskes mentioned, and that has undergone evolution. This behavior has undergone an evolution. We now mostly find articles through journal websites using search engines or through the social media. This is where the predatory journals come in. They are permeating the research community all over the world in all disciplines at every career stage. Some of these journals also serve as agents for special interest groups to promote their ideas under the guise of publishing scientific papers, very much similar to what Professor McNutt alluded to about the fossil fuel issue. There is no clear consensus on how to define predatory publishers and journals. But most papers published in these journals are loosely reviewed, evidences are not rigorously checked, and journal policies are not clearly defined. So the publishers try to exploit the open access publishing model by charging exorbitant fees and then fail to provide editorial services. So these are all detrimental to the growth of science and technology, as we know. Now, during 2011 and 12, there were very few predatory journals, and now it has crossed even a number in about 1,000, and there are about some hijacked journals as well. According to a recent IAP document, in a global survey, they have indicated that 11% of people of the 1,800 respondents checked have already published in a predatory journal. 4% have participated in a predatory conference, and 8 to 6% did not know if they have. So this is a real cause of worry. And an analysis by Publons have revealed that it hosts about 6,000 records of reviews for more than 1,000 predatory journals. And also now we have this non-peer-reviewed documents, about 6,000 preprints that were published between January 1st and April 30 on COVID-19. These papers were not peer-reviewed and has not passed the test of peer review, but there is no dearth of citing these papers. So while ramification of misinformation received through these journals are wide and has serious implications in various fields of science, who are most affected by them? At the basic level, these are primarily inexperienced researchers who imbibe the principles of ethics and integrity while they learn on the job. Now, sometimes they fall prey to these journals because they are still not well informed and are confused between the sources of reliable and unreliable information. The believable websites, the invitations often lure young faculty. It is not unusual to receive emails, we all receive, to be a member of the editorial board of journals, invitations to write an article or to attend a world-class conference. All these can fool people. The inexperienced researchers would yield to this temptation of having a quick publication or going to a good conference. So early in their career, often they make these mistakes, but some experienced scientists also do. Now, what should the researchers be aware when it comes to predatory journals? They have false. These journals also have false ISSN. Because many of these are faked, stolen, or just made up. About 40% of the journals are like that. And a similar proportion, they say that they're based in US, the largest amount in any country, but sometimes the addresses are fake addresses such as vacant lots in US towns. So predatory publishers are good at following new trends and easily fool early researchers. So now, what is one trend in predatory publishing that researchers and institutions should be wary of? Because journal hijacking, where scammers appropriate URLs of legitimate high-ranking journals, and there are about so far 8 hijacked journals. And what should institutions do to tackle predatory publishing? The main thing is education, education, and education. Awareness of young as well as experienced authors is required. And some scientists are fairly naive when it comes to threats that reside in scholarly publishing. In other words, the pitfalls of publishing in a predatory journal. Now, there is a role of a publication officer. There's a role for the librarian to educate the early career faculty or even late career faculty about about these predatory publishing journals. The most worrisome fact is that the PubMed and the Scopus also have in their databases these predatory journals. Some, not all, but some. It is very worrisome that it is there in those sites. So thus it is very necessary that these databases are free of contamination by the data published in these. So the consequences of a failure on our part to address predatory practices is extremely damaging. There are various reasons to this, as fueling of misinformation in public policy and also the publication of knowledge that may not necessarily be based on solid evidence proven faulty later. It erodes the public trust in science. Science will benefit if we provide guidance about what is good publishing practice and in a dynamic mode as the scenario keeps on changing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We had 4 very good lectures, and I'll come back to Dr. Marcia before I open up, if she would like to make any last minute comments or whatever.
Well, first of all, I thought these were terrific presentations, really enriched this whole topic. One thing I will say to Professor Shaha is one additional problem with predatory publishing that we have observed in the US is a symbiotic relationship between many faculty and the predatory journal. I think it stems from the fact that we do not have a great system of measuring impact of researchers. And so many of our universities that aren't even top tier universities require of their science faculty that they publish 2 or 3 papers a year in order to show research output. These faculty often have unbelievable teaching loads. And for them to find the time to do 2 or 3 reputable publications a year is very difficult. So they write up just about anything and they submit it to a predatory journal. They know it's not going to get peer reviewed. They don't want it peer reviewed. They don't want to have to deal with reviews. They don't want to have to revise the paper. They just want a publication they can put on their CV and get their merit increase for the year. So unless we actually tackle also the incentive system in the research enterprise, we're going to have a hard time holding the predatory publishers to account.
Well, this happens in India quite a bit. Would you like to respond to any of the questions in the chat box, Marcia?
Oh, yes. So I mentioned in the chat box that I love these questions that are coming forward about the issue of how do we characterize what was previously an acceptable or credible scientific theory that came through in a publication, which is later overturned. First of all, it wasn't misinformation when it was published, but what happens is if it is continued to be communicated as though it is accepted science after it has been disproven, that is the point that it becomes misinformation. We should never criticize any researcher for having published something that was perfectly credible, logical, and believable at the time. And if it's later overturned, sometimes by even the original author, that is fine. It is just continuing to use it in decision-making or advocating it as the current best model that is when we run into trouble.
There is a question for Dr. Thorp. Would you like to respond to that, Dr. Thorp? How do you see the role of journals like Science in political conflict situations?
Yes.
Recently, you've seen the question, I suppose.
I do. I mean, people have been asking if we're going to stop taking papers, for example, from Russia right now. We're not going to. Most Russian we're not going to boycott anybody. Most Russian scientists are against the war. We welcome scientific collaboration and contributions from everyone. So we don't have any plans to do that. And I also think that a very small number of journals have said they're going to do that. And I expect most of them will not sustain that because science is based on the free exchange of ideas, and we welcome outstanding science from anywhere.
Thank you. Very clear. Is there any question from those who are on the Zoom platform? Is there any question from anybody from the Zoom platform?
Dr. Lal.
Can I ask one question?
Yes, sir.
Hi.
This is Professor Sood, past president of the Indian National Science Academy.
Yeah. So I was just wondering, this case of genetic modified crops, I fail to understand, is it that the misinformation or disinformation has succeeded so much that there is still so much of opposition in accepting this by the public and really looking at it from the scientific point of view? The reason I'm saying is that sometime back, our academy had brought a report on this, but it was trashed so much by the public and by the political bigwigs that it was not really clear that there was any scientific merit in what they were saying. So have you thought about that? What could be the way forward when the opposition is so strong that in spite of best scientific discourse, it's not succeeding? Is it the way we are communicating, or is it the inherent kind of disbelief in scientific discourse which is being given by scientists? So what could be the reason and how to handle it?
Well, I can jump in with one viewpoint on that. So in the US, the National Academy did a big study on genetically modified crops. We were very careful, the committee was, in going through the literature and eliminating from consideration any work that had a conflict of interest, because it was either supported by Monsanto or one of the other genetic seed companies, or if it was supported by an NGO that was known to oppose genetically modified organisms. Once you throw all that out and only look at science that was honestly funded by a neutral party to get at the answer, the result was that there isn't actually any scientific basis for concern about health. But what went wrong discussion is that there might be ethical reasons why someone might reject GMOs because of the business practices of the companies that weren't letting farmers use their own seed, because of concerns about biodiversity or other knock-on effects. These were all legitimate, that had nothing to do with the safety to humans, but rather had to do with other aspects of it. And science isn't going to answer the question of, is it ethical to not let farmers use their own seeds? So there were lots of concerns that were outside of the realm of what science could currently answer. And I think it wasn't always clear where was the concern, but it certainly, from a scientific viewpoint, shouldn't be based on health.
Yeah, and if I could just could I jump in there? Because I'd like to underscore what Marcia just said, which I think is crucially important. And you said it so well that I was almost going to just say, I don't need to say anything more, but there is one additional piece. If you are interested in this problem, I mean, this is a really, really good example of a problem where there is a scientific component, but there are also very important additional ethical and political economy components. If you haven't read Pope Francis's encyclical on climate change, he also actually discusses GMOs in that encyclical, and he talks about why he opposes them from a theological standpoint. Now, you can agree or disagree with the Pope's position, but it's a very clear articulation of what a concern is, that is not about whether it's safe to eat, but is about other things. So I strongly recommend reading that. And if you haven't already read the encyclical on climate change, well, then you have to read it anyway for that reason. So thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else would like to ask a question in the Zoom platform first?
Can I say
Yes, sir.
something?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I would like to mention two things. Now, in view of this conflict in Europe, the academies, organizations, including ISC, the International Council for Science, and IAP, the Inter-Academy Partnership, we have also finalized a statement because we are worried about the inter-academic relationship across the globe. So this will be released tomorrow, and I encourage all of you to read and give your comment if you like to give that. Another thing which I want to mention is when we have these organizations of academies, I had been invited recently on what they call World Academies of Arts and Science, WASA. So this academy was very interesting because they said arts alone cannot tackle human problems and science also alone cannot tackle. So we should come. I was invited in one of the panel discussion, and some of the points they made was good because many of these people had served in UN bodies. So they were more close. In fact, scientifically, we are quite okay, but they are very close to reality in the world, what is happening and how science can be do. So IAP has been interacting with them. One more point I want to say that the precision measurement is very important. If you have precision measurement, many of the problems can be solved. I recall at one time I was involved, the question of methane from the being emitted from the paddy fields and also from the cattle. In India, there was a huge movement that they will ban India because you are producing 40 teratons per year of methane and global warming and so on. But with very well-calibrated precision measurement involving international team, we could prove what they were thinking, 40 teratons, it was hardly 11 teratons. And after that, nobody talked of methane emission from India. Why I am saying is that when you have precision measurements, well-defined precision measurement, many of these problems can be solved. This is all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Is there anybody else who would like to raise a point? Very quick, if it's an important one. We are getting a bit late.
Can I just make a brief comment? This is Professor Saikya,
Yes.
and
Yes.
regarding Professor Shaha's concern about predatory journals. And it is in India, part of the problem has also been the UGC's recognition, the initial list, having a lot of predatory journals always have been weeded out. And I remember that when UGC first went about it, I was the Vice Chancellor at Cotton University in Guwahati, and they wrote letters to the Vice Chancellor to suggest journals, which is probably completely the wrong way because there was so much of pressure from publishers to put in and recommend their journals. And I'm sure some may have yielded to that as well. But my query was that, is it possible for the academies to work with UGC to at least weed out all predatory journals from the list of recognized journals for academic promotions? Because I think that would help, because that is part of the problem which we are facing right now across the higher education sector.
I think, sir, that has been largely being done and is being done on a regular basis, sir.
I see, but there's still significant
It's still
numbers.
there, but they keep 100 a day. What do we do? By the time. Okay, is there anybody else who would like to raise a question?
There are some questions on the YouTube.
Yeah, so I'll come to you now. You can take up the YouTube questions very quickly. Take the important ones.
A question by Parthasarthi E.V. Ranga. How do we check the disinformation by business lobby to promote their business?
Anybody can take a question.
I think that might be for Naomi.
How do we?
Sorry, I couldn't hear. Could you repeat the question?
How do we check the disinformation by business lobby to promote their business?
Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, well, that's obviously an extremely important question. I think there are many things, but the one I would focus on is essentially what we could call naming and shaming, that we have evidence from social science research that when you identify this, when you show that it's not scientific information, but it's disinformation, and that it's motivated by economic interests, this is very effective in helping people to separate actual scientific information from disinformation. So I think that's the most important thing that we as scientists can do. And of course, as citizens, we can be politically engaged to work for the kinds of political action that we want. Because, you know, one thing I heard years ago from Bob Inglis, a very conservative Republican congressman who I've worked with, he says, you know, congressmen hear all the times from the business interests, but they rarely hear from scientists. We don't pick up the phone, we don't call them because we just want to do our work, but they need to hear from us. And so that's another thing that we as scientists can do.
Thank you, Professor. Now there is a question by Ram. This is not uncommon to see social scientists themselves actively perpetuating the disinformation on issues particularly concerning the demographic antiquity of the populace. Your opinion?
I'm not sure I quite understood it, saying that social scientists are promoting disinformation on what issue?
On the issue particularly concerning the demographic antiquity of the population.
The democratic antiquity of the population.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm afraid that's not a topic I'm familiar with. If someone else is, maybe they can jump in here.
Yeah, I'm not sure I quite get the point of the question either.
But there are claims about certain populations being very old or more primitive than the other populations. So these are the claims being made by the social scientists.
Well, I think this maybe here's how we can address this that could be helpful. So I think, you know, Marcia talked about something that is very important to me that I've written on a lot, which is the notion of scientific consensus. So, and Holden spoke to this as well. As scientists, we welcome debate, and we especially welcome evidence-based debate. So if people have evidence, people have data, people have mathematical arguments for why something should be given due consideration, then it is a crucial part of science that be heard. And this is one of the arguments I've made in my work for the importance of diversity, both demographic and intellectual, that we have to be open to different perspectives, different ideas, particularly when they're supported by evidence. But if they have no evidence, then we're right in saying, well, you know, come back when you have evidence. And as well, we need to make a distinction between topics that are topics of live debate that we haven't resolved yet, of which there are many, versus topics for which we have a hard-earned consensus. So, you know, just to talk about the area I've studied most closely, I mean, I've just finished a paper about the historical roots of climate science going back to the International Geophysical Year in 1958. Climate scientists have been working seriously on the issue of man-made climate change for 63 years. And that's an easy number for me to remember because I was born in 1958. This is not a fad, this is not a fashion, this is not something that we haven't figured out yet. This is something that we have studied really, really well. And so we are in a very strong epistemological position to say there is a consensus, and it's based on an enormous amount of diverse evidence collected by scientists from all over the globe, men and women, black and brown, global north, global south. That's not the case with some other issues. And so if it's an issue that has not been well studied, then it may well be appropriate for us to say we should do more work.
Okay. One last question. One last.
Okay.
You have anybody would like to say something?
That's okay.
Any of the panelists would like to make a comment? Okay, one last question I can take.
There is a general question from Yasmin Chaudhary on YouTube. She asks, do you think that scientists have the responsibility of putting out correct information in an easily understandable, non-technical way on platforms such as social media?
Yeah.
So I would say scientists are increasingly emphasizing the importance of communicating. Now, there's a lot of science that's done that is really only of interest to other scientists because it's really esoteric stuff. I don't think we have to figure out how to communicate that on social media platforms. But when something actually does have a direct public implication, then I think we do. And I think we have to also engage with civil society in a discussion of the work. Communication has to be two ways, not just one way.
Okay, I think
Yeah.
with that, is there any other question left?
There are some comments, short comments. Like
You
G.S.
read
Rotella
out.
says, scientists have to win the full confidence of society in order not to rely on misinformation. Then there is a question about alternative medicines, which inundated the COVID-19 treatment domain with a lot of false claims, with the prescription claiming it as scientific.
Okay, I think we'll leave it at that. But one last question, maybe question. Can I ask a question, Doctor? And that is
Yes, go ahead.
that science would need funding, and funding would always come with strings of some kind, be it political, be it business oriented, whatever. Are there any roadmaps where we can make science free of any strings?
No.
No. So then how do we survive?
Well,
Because
I'll tell you, one of the things that cracks me up is that, I hear scientists say, well, I don't take research money from foundations because, it's neoliberals who made money and they're sanitizing their reputation by through philanthropy. And so Mike Bloomberg and Chan Zuckerberg and the Gates Foundation, I don't take that tainted money. I just take money from the NIH. Well, the federal funding is predicated on a nationalistic agenda that most scientists would find shocking if they actually watch the hearings. So to try to say, well, philanthropic dollars are more or less pristine somehow than money from the government, I mean, that's just a very naive way of looking at it. And so I think scientists informing themselves about where the money comes from and how it's obtained is very, very important.
Okay. One last thing I like to request you all. Take home message for the academies. One take home from each one of you of what the academies could be doing in the near future to ensure that the trust between science and the society regains its traction. So if you have each
in 30 seconds or less.
30 seconds. So your time starts now, Marcia.
Okay. So the one thing I would do is try to encourage the public to think that everyone can be a scientist. If you simply have a hunch or an idea and you develop a method for testing your idea, you present your work for scrutiny by others, and you take the criticism, that's basically the essence of the scientific method. And I think we need to lower this barrier between scientists and non-scientists by encouraging everyone to be a scientist.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you so much. Naomi.
Well, I would follow up on that and maybe flip it and say, and also to embrace the message that every scientist is a person, and that our personal stories and our personal message are part of what make us interesting and trustworthy to people. And so this idea we have that we need to suppress our personal identity is just really wrong-headed.
Yeah, you emphasize this in your lecture also. Okay, Professor Boulton, we've not seen you for some time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, having knowledge of quite a number of academies, I'd say they're enormously varied. And if I can produce off the spur of the moment, a taxonomy, one sort of academy is involved in rewarding people with honours, and we can dismiss those as rather not to be followed. A second sort is concerned primarily with the highest levels of scientific achievement, Nobel Prizes, new theories in theoretical physics and the like. Another sort is concerned primarily with making the interface with government, with developing certain capacities to be able to give policy advice that's responsive to what they see as political priorities. And occasionally, you find one that engages in real terms with ordinary folk. The Icelandic Academy, which I know well, several years ago had a rule that every single person who wrote a paper in their journal must also produce a paper for a journal amongst the many in Iceland, which are directed towards amateurs and in almost any field you like, in philosophy or in natural history. It's also true to say, of course, that the citizen science movement has exploded. And it's one of the areas where academies really ought to start getting their hands dirty. I mean, if one looks at this, I mean, for example, a friend of mine down the road, not a scientist, is now one of about 15,000 people who've been making systematic observations on dieback of oak trees in Britain, which is beginning to develop at quite some rate. It's a process which couldn't have been done by any other means. Spaceborne radar wouldn't have done it. A few scientists from a national survey wouldn't have done it. You need to use people on a grand scale. And of course, the clever department, the Home Office department, then feeds back their results to them. And the interaction between government, by particularly the Royal Society of Edinburgh in this particular case, and ordinary scientists is considerable. The opportunities are vast, and we ought to exploit it more. But I'm afraid that too many of our academies have their heads in the air and not their feet on the ground. We need both.
You say it so well and so effectively. Professor Shaha.
Yes, I would endorse Marcia's views, but what I would emphasize is that while we are communicating science to the public, we should also tell them something about the process of science, how we do the experiments, what we do, because often the information is misunderstood or expectations are more because they don't understand the process, how we do science. So I think that is something that academies can actually impart.
Thank you so much. We are very near to the time, and I would request Professor Devang Kakkar, Vice President, Science and Society of the Indian National Science Academy, to propose a vote of thanks for a very wonderful evening and wonderful speakers. Very pleasant evening we had. Professor Kakkar, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Professor Singhvi. It's really a privilege for me to thank everyone who has participated in today's program. And of course, I want to thank all those who helped to organize it. My congratulations first to Professor Marcia McNutt, President of the National Academy of Sciences of the US, on receiving the Jawaharlal Nehru Medal. Pandit Nehru was our first Prime Minister and a great supporter of science and science institutions, including the one that I'm currently working in, IIT Bombay. My thanks to Professor McNutt for delivering an enlightening lecture on a topic of great current interest, given all the misinformation that is flowing as a result of the pandemic and climate change. I would like to thank the members of the panel, Professor Geoffrey Boulton, Professor Naomi Oreskes, Professor Holden Thorp, and Professor Chandrima Shaha for their insightful and thought-provoking ideas on science and science communication. It was really a very exciting panel discussion. I must thank Professor Ashok Singhvi, our host, former Vice President of Indian National Science Academy, for organizing and hosting this program. I would also like to thank several people who helped behind the scenes to make this program possible. Dr. Anna Bashkirova from the National Academy of Sciences, Dr. Ann Thiem from the International Science Council, and several colleagues from the Indian National Science Academy, including Professor M.K. Mehra, Dr. V.K. Arora, Dr. Protati Chattopadhyay, Dr. Seema Mandal, Mr. Karthik, and of course, Dr. C.M. Nautiyal. My thanks to all those who joined the program and helped to make it a success with their questions and comments. With that, we come to an end to this very
And one last point,
program. Yes, please, you need the last word. I think.
No, I'm sorry. One last, I forgot, I'm sorry. We may want to bring out a small booklet on this event in terms of some articles. So I would like the speakers to think about if they could contribute a short note. We could probably give the transcripts of whatever was spoken, but I would request them to think about it, and I will come back to them in a few days' time after the weekend. Have a nice weekend. Thank you so much. I'm sorry, Professor Kakkar, to have interjected.
Oh, no, very nice of you. Thank you and good night all. And of course, good day to all those in the US.
Thank you so much to all of you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.